I hope so. There you go. So I'm going to talk about the relationship. Often, can you see it?
Yes.
I'm going to talk about the relationship, often very difficult or romanticized, between fashion and art. This is an ongoing project, but I have started a while ago. So when entering this sort of discussion, I'm always tempted to start with a quote by Virgil, which is "Flectere sine quo superos aceronta movebo," roughly translatable as, "If I will not be able to bend the gods, I will raise hell." This quote explains how awry people look at me when I say so unabashedly that, no, for me, fashion is not art. And they look at me even more puzzled when they find out how much I love and esteem fashion. And yet, as I will try to argue, it is precisely because of my love for both fashion and art that I believe a line must be drawn between them. Very often, fashionistas, as well as fashion scholars, tend to see fashion as a form of art, merely in an attempt of elevating fashion. Art, in their view, tends not to be seen as a domain or a noun, but as an adjective, almost a synonym of good, worthy, or high quality. On the contrary, in my view, fashion and art are two different domains, governed by different rules and validated by different symbolic systems, places, and people. The first thing to do, then, is to clear the way from the rather naive association of the word art with standard of high quality, because for me it is not. Another fundamental reason why art and fashion are seen as one and the same thing is because both, to some extent, hinge upon creativity. And yet, the more I study the two domains, the more the similarities seem to me an anamorphic distortion. In other words, they do look similar from far away, but the closer one gets to looking at them side by side, the lesser similarities they seem to share. In my research, I'm considering several approaches which have contributed in the definition of the meanings of fields such as art and fashion. These fields are the sociology of art and fashion, the analysis of art and fashion business, and the pivotal field of aesthetics. In other words, the branch of philosophy which deals with the very definition of what art is. The latter is what I'm going to unfold in greater detail right now. The 20th century, especially after Dada and pop art pushed the boundaries of art to an unprecedented extreme, posed to philosophers and art critics a cumbersome new set of questions, such as, before two identical objects, let's say a urinal or a soap box, one of which is art and one of which is not, what makes the difference? What allows us to call one object art and its twin object not art? The solution to the riddle was provided by several philosophers, amongst which Emilio Garroni, but especially Arthur Danto. They came up with similar solutions, but essentially the answer for both is meaning. Art, says Danto, is an embodied concept. This applies as much as to Leonardo da Vinci as much as it does to Warhol. It is not about visible, but about invisible properties. It is not about beauty or mimesis, skills or materials, but about the participation of a given artwork in the creation of meaning. Art is not an object, but a meaning which uses an object to be conveyed. In this sense, art is the exact opposite of fashion, which tends to be a radicalized object, often an object which escapes being caged by meaning. Think about the way in which Galliano took the insignias of royalty and the Catholic Church and devoid them of their original meanings of holiness and power, in order to convey always the same message: I am fashion. The finest form of fashion, couture, is all about materiality and construction, and it is consumed because of its material qualities. Scholars who try to see similarities between fashion and art look at the objectual characteristics of both artifacts, whilst in fact what ascribes them to two different realms is precisely the way in which they signify. By comparing their objectual qualities, the scholars overlook the ontological differences that extend beyond their materiality. Yet, to me, this is always problematic. It would be like trying to explain the commonality between the urinals found in men's bathrooms and Duchamp's fountain just by focusing on their material similarities, rather than analyzing their radically different non-objectual qualities and functions. Usually, the examples that these scholars quote to support their thesis are the marvelous teals and lobster dresses by Schiaparelli, the Mondrian dress by Saint Laurent. And often Lady Gaga and her uncanny yet fascinating dress are called into question. However, it is ironic how all these examples, rather than being original art pieces themselves, are appropriations of pre-existing art pieces, sometimes done in collaboration with the artist, like in Schiaparelli's case with, of course, Salvador Dali. To this, it should be added that usually when artists include fashion in their creations, it's mostly to criticize rather than to praise it. It was the case with Jana Stöback, Sylvie Fleury, but also photographer turned artist Jürgen Teller with his project Go See. In other words, the love between the two domains does not seem to be mutual. As anticipated at the beginning, I am a fashion lover, and this is precisely the reason that pushed me to analyze this topic. There are more risks than benefit in forcing the relationship between art and fashion. The first is suggested by philosopher Lars Svensson, when he says that if fashion is to be considered art, the first would be destined to occupy an ancillary position, a sort of less refined form of art. And sincerely, who needs that? The second point I borrow from Llewellyn Negrin, who points out how every time that one applies art theories to understanding fashion, they obliterate the materiality of the dress, its being more or less wearable, its pervasive market, and the logic of its consumption. In other words, its most distinctive and precious features, the aspects which deeply impact the daily lives of most people around the world. Ultimately, it is tempting to claim that fashion shines more when understood as an autonomous entity, an object to be worn, rather than a mere support of meaning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.
So, thoughts, questions?
Wow. I didn't raise hell, but I raised silence.
No, I have a question for Chupi.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that you're also what you're pointing out for the fashion scholars of what they are looking at and what they are not looking at, and also, one of the problematics, maybe, what would your idea be on the fact that fashion has extensively used art, to market itself? So maybe the relationship between the two, it isn't so much placed on trying to associate, trying to see whether the two elements, art and fashion, are similar or not, but on how they are feeding off each other, rather, and as you say, I imagine, if you could say more, are you interested in how they engage with each other, or are you more preoccupied with stressing where they are separate, or how does your research develop?
No, that's very interesting, and I agree with you. It's a mutual. They feed each other in different ways. One of them is patronage, but it's funny how one of the most important patrons of the arts in Italy, who is Miuccia Prada, virtually one of the greatest art collectors in the world, created the Fondazione Prada, wanting it to be separate, to be completely different from the brand, because the Fondazione does not belong to the Prada group, only belongs to Miuccia Prada and her husband. And she always claims not to be an artist. Yet, it would be impossible to understand Prada without understanding this love for art. So, of course, the relationship is... And if I think about Ferragamo, when in the 30s he used Lucio Venna, a futurist, to advertise his shoes, those are all extremely beneficial things. The problem is that people only list them and mention them and never get involved into what this entails theoretically. And this leads to a confusion between the two fields that does not benefit fashion for me. But having said that, yes, I think it would be impossible to understand not just fashion, but any creative field, such as product design, for instance, without understanding art, the way in which there is an exchange between that and art. So I am highly interested in this mutual borrowing. The thing that I noticed though is that when art borrows from fashion, unless when art is paid by fashion, okay, let's say Vanessa Beecroft or some Cindy Sherman things, when art is paid by fashion, it doesn't criticize as much, but when it touches on it independently, it does criticize fashion very much. So to me, this is an asymmetry that has not been studied enough, and to me helps putting things in the map.
Also interesting the way fashion is shown and how that skews people's perception of it as something of functional clothing or as art. There was some project I remember seeing a few years ago where clothes were forced over a cube and they were displayed tightly over these cubes, and it was some sort of gallery thing, but how they were no longer identifiable in quite the same way as clothes. They were recognizable because of things like lapels and buttons and collars and bits, but they weren't garment shaped in any conventional sense. So then people start to, you know, is it a garment? Is it a piece of art when it's sort of reformed in some way?
In fact, I think this leads me to two considerations. One is something that Elizabeth Wilson and somebody else as well wrote, and I find extremely interesting, which is the fact that every time that fashion is shown in a museum, somehow is a castrated object, because it loses its softness, its comfort, is not on a body in the way in which it's designed to be. Whereas if you see, for instance, and this is what it's sort of uncanny, the way in which clothes are shown behind a glass, especially they are shown after many years when they are no longer in fashion. So they become almost alienated from their being clothes, and they acquire a different life, which is, I think, along the lines of what you're saying. And the other consideration is that sometimes dresses are art, but in that very moment they stop being fashion. One example is the Margiela amazing exhibition in Belgium, the one, do you remember? The one with mushrooms on the garments. But those garments were no longer wearable. They were no longer in the system of fashion. And this I'm analyzing through the business and especially the sociological approaches, which teach us how things are given their meaning from the surrounding context rather than in themselves. So is it art? So for instance, you go to a museum and you see, I don't know, a radiator, and you think, oh, this may be an artwork, this may be a ready-made, but you don't think the same when you see that same object in your house. And this is not because of the intrinsic qualities, but it's just because of the place where this happens. And this is the domain of course, sociology of art. Don't know if I went off topic, but yeah.
No,